On the morning I was removed from the company I built, my father handed my sister the corner office and told security to walk me out. I had tripled revenue in 4 years. She had never read a balance sheet. 1 year later, the business was bankrupt, the accounts were frozen, and a number I hadn't blocked lit up my phone 47 times with a single, desperate message. Please come back. I didn't answer. Not once. But this story starts long before the bankruptcy, before the 47 messages, before my father had to confront the single most expensive mistake of his life. It starts with a pattern so quiet and so consistent that I almost mistook it for normal. The question that haunted me then, and the question that will drive everything you're about to hear, is this. When a parent chooses a favorite over the capable, how long can the whole structure hold before the foundation cracks? And what happens when the one they pushed away is the only one who knows how to rebuild? My father started the business in our garage when I was 12. It was a wholesale textile distribution company. Nothing glamorous, bolts of fabric, shipping manifests, warehouses that smelled like dust and machine oil. He named it Halstead Textiles after our family name, and from the beginning, he treated it as his third child, the one he actually understood. My sister Vanessa and I grew up between inventory sheets and order forms, but we were never equal in that world. Vanessa was the face that got brought along to client dinners, the one who posed in photos at trade shows with her bright smile and easy laugh. I was the one who stayed back at the office calculating margins and figuring out how to stretch a thin payroll through the end of the month. He didn't call it favoritism. He called it playing to strengths. Vanessa is the people person. You're the numbers person. As if that division justified everything that came later. By the time I graduated college with a degree in business operations, Halstead Textiles was bleeding. The recession had gutted small manufacturers, and our client list had shriveled to a handful of legacy accounts that paid late and complained constantly. My father was in denial, convinced that loyalty and handshake deals would carry us through. Vanessa was in her junior year, studying communications, posting photos from sorority formals while my father bragged about her social skills. I came home, walked into that office, and spent 6 months digging through every contract, every vendor relationship, every inefficiency. I discovered we were overpaying suppliers by 17% because my father had never renegotiated terms. I found that our best customers had been leaving for competitors with better online ordering systems, while we still took orders by fax. I built a digital platform, I streamlined logistics, I cold-called 50 former clients and won back 23 of them. Within 4 years, I had tripled revenue. I didn't just patch holes. I rebuilt the foundation. And my father never once introduced me as the reason the company still existed. That recognition was reserved for Vanessa. She joined the company after graduation with no relevant experience, no understanding of supply chains, and no apparent interest in learning them. But she had my father's ear in a way I never would. He gave her a title Vice President of Client Relations and a 6-figure salary, despite the fact that she had never closed a sale or managed a team. When I raised concerns, he accused me of being jealous and territorial. "You can't stand that your sister is finally contributing," he said, as if showing up to meetings late and leaving early was contributing. The pattern that had shaped my childhood had simply been imported into the business. One daughter performed the miracle of survival, and the other collected the applause. But here's the thing that makes this story different from the ones you've heard before. I didn't leave. I stayed because I believed the business was bigger than my father's blindness. I believed that if I kept proving my value, the truth would eventually become undeniable. That was my mistake. Because in a family business, competence doesn't guarantee loyalty, and loyalty doesn't always flow toward the person who actually shows up. It flows toward the one who makes them feel like the old days, like the myth they've built about themselves. Vanessa made my father feel like a wise patriarch passing down a legacy to his sparkling heir. I made him feel obsolete, and that, more than any financial decision, sealed my fate. The dinner where everything shifted happened on a Thursday in late September. My father called it a family meeting, which meant he had already made a decision and wanted to deliver it with wine and linen napkins to soften the blow. We sat at his dining table, the same table where I had once done homework while he ignored my report cards. Vanessa looked nervous but expectant. He announced that he was stepping back from day-to-day operations and that Vanessa would assume the role of CEO, effective immediately. I would remain as Chief Operating Officer, reporting to her. The words landed like a physical blow. I asked why, trying to keep my voice steady. He said Vanessa had the vision and the personality to lead the company into its next chapter, while I had the operational skills to support her. It sounds so reasonable when you say it plainly. But what he meant was that I had built an engine, and now he was handing the keys to someone who had never driven anything faster than a golf cart. What I didn't know then, what I couldn't have seen from across that dinner table, was that Vanessa had been meeting with him privately for months. She had presented a plan, a glossy presentation full of buzzwords about rebranding and expansion and influencer partnerships, promises she had no idea how to execute. She had convinced him that the future of textiles was in direct-to-consumer lifestyle branding, a concept she barely understood, but could pitch with the confidence of someone who had never been held accountable for a failed strategy. My father loved it because it sounded like reinvention, like the kind of bold move he imagined himself making if he were younger. It didn't matter that the numbers didn't work. It didn't matter that I had built the company's stability on conservative growth and operational discipline. He wanted to believe in her, and wanting was enough. The first 6 months under Vanessa were a disaster dressed in expensive marketing campaigns. She hired a branding agency that charged 6 figures for a new logo and a website redesign, neither of which addressed the actual customer acquisition problems I had been flagging for years. She launched a direct-to-consumer line of home textiles that required massive upfront investment in inventory, ignoring my warnings about cash flow. She fired 2 of our most experienced sales representatives because they had questioned her strategy, replacing them with friends from college who had never worked in B2B sales. I watched the financial cushion I had spent years building erode month by month, and every time I raised a red flag, my father told me to support my sister and trust the process. "You're too risk-averse," he said. "You're going to hold her back with your negativity." And still, I stayed. I stayed through the first missed revenue target, the first vendor dispute, the first time we had to delay a payroll by 3 days because Vanessa had overcommitted on a photo shoot for the lifestyle brand that no one was buying. I stayed because I thought loyalty meant absorbing damage that wasn't mine to absorb. I thought that if I left, the company would collapse, and I would be blamed for walking away. I thought my father would finally see what was happening and correct course. I was wrong on every count. The moment of my removal came not after a failure, but after a success. A major hotel chain had reached out about a contract for their entire property portfolio. It was the kind of deal that would stabilize us for years. I led the negotiations, built the proposal, and secured the verbal commitment. When I presented it to my father and sister, expecting finally to be recognized for saving the company from the very problems Vanessa had created, my father looked at me with a strange, cold expression. He said that Vanessa would take over the account relationship, that I was too aggressive in my approach, that the client needed a softer touch. And when I refused, when I said the deal was mine and I would see it through, he told me to clear out my office. Just like that. 23 years of loyalty and sacrifice ended in a single sentence. I was so stunned I couldn't speak. I just stood there while my sister avoided my eyes, and my father looked at me like I was a supplier he was firing for poor performance. Security was waiting at my door. I packed my desk into a single box while the people I had trained and mentored watched in silence. No one said goodbye. No one stopped me. I walked out of the building I had saved, got into my car, and sat in the parking lot for an hour, staring at the steering wheel and trying to understand how the person who had done everything right had ended up with nothing. That was the last time I set foot in Halstead Textiles as an employee. But it was not the last time the company would need me, because within 11 months, everything Vanessa touched would unravel. Key accounts would defect, the warehouse would be half empty, and my father, the man who had chosen charm over competence, would be sitting in his empty office staring at a phone, composing a text message he never thought he would have to send. The first of 47, but I'm getting ahead of myself. First, you have to understand what it felt like to be erased from a company you brought back from the dead, and then to watch that erasure play out on a screen in real time while the world refused to acknowledge what it was costing. That's what happened next. For the first time in my adult life, I had nowhere to be on a Monday morning. I woke up in my apartment, stared at the ceiling, and realized that no one was waiting for me to approve a purchase order. No vendor was panicking about a delayed shipment. No client needed a problem solved before lunch. The silence was deafening. I had built my entire identity around that company, and now it was gone, severed completely and without ceremony. I spent the first week in a fog, replaying the security guard's blank expression, my father's cold dismissal, my sister's averted eyes. I thought about calling a lawyer, but what was I going to claim? Wrongful termination from a family business where the owner is your father. I had no leverage, no contract that couldn't be undone by his signature. I had built that company, but on paper, I was just an employee who could be replaced. That was the brutal legal reality of family businesses. Your contributions are only as protected as your relationship with the people in charge, and my relationship had just been set on fire. But I couldn't afford to spiral. I had savings, but not indefinitely. I started interviewing, quietly at first, then more aggressively. Within 3 months, I had accepted a position as director of operations at a competitor, a company called Meridian Supply Group. They had watched Halstead Textiles from a distance for years, and they knew exactly why the company had thrived. They offered me a salary 40% higher than what I had been making, along with equity that would vest over 5 years. When I signed the contract, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, a future that wasn't contingent on someone else's approval. The irony was not lost on me. The very people who had discarded me had inadvertently freed me. I didn't broadcast my move. I didn't post about it on LinkedIn or send a mass email to my former colleagues. But word travels fast in a small industry. Within 2 weeks, I started getting texts from people I used to manage. People who had watched me be escorted out and had said nothing. Now they wanted to connect, to grab coffee, to fill me in on what was happening at Halstead. At first, I ignored them. I wanted a clean break. But curiosity is a powerful thing, and eventually, I said yes to a coffee with Marisol, a former logistics coordinator who had always been straightforward with me. Marisol told me things I could barely process. Within 60 days of my departure, Vanessa had fired the entire operations team I had built and replaced them with consultants from a firm she had found on Instagram. The hotel chain contract I had secured, the one that was supposed to be a lifeline, had fallen through because Vanessa had missed a critical deadline on the final proposal. The client walked, and they took their business to a competitor. Inventory was piling up in the warehouse with no distribution plan. The digital ordering platform I had built was being neglected, riddled with bugs that no one knew how to fix. And my father, the man who had told me I was too risk-averse, had taken out a substantial loan against the company's assets to fund Vanessa's rebranding campaign, a campaign that had generated exactly 0 new accounts. Marisol said she was looking for a new job, and she wasn't the only one. The rats were leaving the ship. I listened, nodded, and paid for her coffee. On the drive home, I didn't know whether to cry or laugh. The destruction I had predicted was unfolding exactly as I had warned, and I was no longer there to stop it. But here's the part that surprised me. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt hollow, because the people who would suffer most from this collapse weren't my father and sister. They were the remaining employees, the ones who had mortgages and kids and no family safety net. They were the suppliers who had counted on our contracts. They were the clients who had trusted us. My father's decision was a grenade, and everyone around him was bleeding. Then the messages started. The first one came on a Tuesday evening, about 5 months after I'd been walked out. My phone buzzed with a text from a number I hadn't blocked because I never expected to hear from it. It was my father. The message was brief and awkwardly formal, as if he were dictating a business letter. "Mallory, I hope you're well. I'd like to discuss some developments at the company. Please call when you have a moment." I stared at the screen, felt my pulse quicken, and deleted it without replying. I told myself that whatever was happening, it was no longer my problem. They had made their choice, and I was finally building something of my own. I didn't owe them a response. 2 days later, a second message arrived. "Mallory, I understand you're upset, but this isn't personal. The company is struggling and your expertise could be valuable. Just a conversation, please." The phrase, "this isn't personal," nearly made me laugh out loud. I had been escorted out of a building I saved by a security guard my father hired. What part of that was not personal? I deleted that message too. Then a third, then a fourth. The tone shifted from formal to urgent, then from urgent to pleading. By the end of the second week, there were 11 messages waiting on my phone, each more desperate than the last. "We're losing accounts. Vanessa is overwhelmed. I made a mistake." That last one stopped me for a full minute. My father had never in my entire life admitted to a mistake. And yet there it was, in black and white, evidence that the ground beneath him was crumbling. I still didn't respond. I didn't block him either. I'm not sure why. Maybe some part of me needed to see the evidence that I had been right all along. What I didn't know then, what no one had told me, was that the situation was far worse than just mismanagement. There was something else at play, a variable I had never even considered because I had been too busy trying to survive my own dismissal. My father hadn't just handed the company to Vanessa out of blind affection. He had done it because he had already planned to sell the business, and he believed that installing his favorite daughter as CEO would make the company look more attractive to potential buyers. A younger, more dynamic face. A story about generational transition. But Vanessa's incompetence had torpedoed the financials so thoroughly that the potential acquirer, a private equity firm that had been circling for over a year, had pulled out of the deal. My father had been counting on that sale to fund his retirement. Now, with the company hemorrhaging cash and no buyer in sight, the walls were closing in. I learned all of this from an unexpected source. 3 weeks after the messages started, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. It was a man named Gerald Fincher, the managing partner of the private equity firm that had been negotiating to buy Halstead Textiles. He had tracked me down through industry contacts. He wanted to know if I had any interest in consulting for them on a potential acquisition, on their terms, not my father's. He told me that the deal had collapsed not just because of the financials, but because Vanessa had been caught misrepresenting the company's inventory numbers during due diligence. She had inflated assets to make the books look healthier than they were. That was reckless, but not necessarily illegal, until Gerald pointed out that my father had signed off on the documents. My father, the man who had always prided himself on his old-school integrity, had allowed falsified numbers to be presented to a buyer. That was the moment I realized the situation had gone from bad to something far more dangerous. My father wasn't just asking me to come back and stabilize a struggling business. He was asking me to come back to a company that might be facing legal exposure. And the 47 messages, which I still hadn't answered, were not just a plea for help. They were a signal that the man who had thrown me away was now drowning, and I was the only person who knew how to swim. I didn't sleep that night. Gerald Fincher's words looped in my head like a warning siren. Falsified inventory numbers, signed off by my father, presented to a buyer. I had spent years protecting Halstead Textiles from exactly this kind of self-inflicted wound, and now the people who had pushed me out had driven the company not just into the red, but into a minefield. Legal exposure in a family business is a specific kind of nightmare. Regular companies have compliance departments, and outside counsel and boards that can remove reckless leadership. Family businesses have Thanksgiving dinner. They have decades of silence and complicity. They have loyalty structures that protect the guilty until the entire edifice collapses. I knew, with a sinking certainty, that my father didn't fully understand what he had signed. Vanessa had probably handed him the documents, and he had trusted her because trust was his proxy for love. That blind spot had now placed him in the path of consequences that could follow him for the rest of his life. The next morning, message number 12 arrived. "Mallory, please. I know you're angry, but there are things happening now you don't know about. It's serious. Call me." The word serious was new. My father had gone from "let's discuss developments" to "I made a mistake" to "it's serious" in the span of a few weeks. I could map his deterioration across those texts like a patience chart trending in the wrong direction. I still didn't reply, but I did call Gerald back. We met at a quiet restaurant far from the industrial park where Halstead Textiles had its warehouse. Gerald was in his late 50s, silver hair, sharp suits, the kind of investor who could read a balance sheet like a novel and spot a plot hole from the first page. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. He told me that the falsified inventory figures had inflated the company's assets by nearly 30%, that Vanessa had created phantom stock entries to cover gaps she had created with her reckless purchasing, and that my father had signed the verification letter without ever checking the actual warehouse. The buyer had discovered the discrepancy during a routine physical count, and the deal had imploded immediately. But it was worse than that. The private equity firm had incurred significant costs during due diligence, and they were considering legal action against Halstead for fraudulent misrepresentation. Not just pulling out of the deal, suing. My father could lose his house. He could lose everything. I sat with that information and felt a strange, dissonant mix of emotions. Part of me, the part that had been discarded like a used part, felt a cold satisfaction. The universe had delivered consequences that my father could not spin or ignore. But another part of me, the part that had spent 2 decades trying to earn a love that was never coming, felt a deep, bone-level grief. Because my father wasn't just a man who had wronged me. He was a man who had been wrong about everything, and now he was going to pay for it in ways that would break him completely. Gerald asked if I would consider consulting for him on a new acquisition strategy. If the company went under, he explained, the assets would be sold off at auction. He wanted someone who knew the business intimately to help him pick the bones. He offered me a substantial fee, no emotional strings attached, just expertise for hire. I told him I needed time to think. That evening, my phone buzzed again, then again. Message 13, then 14, then 15 in rapid succession. The tone had shifted again, this time from pleading to something raw and unfiltered. Your sister has disappeared. She stopped coming to the office last week. I don't know where she is. Then, the bank is calling the loan. They want a meeting next Tuesday. Then, Mallory, if you ever cared about this family, please. I don't know what to do. I read those words and imagined my father alone in his office, surrounded by the wreckage of his choices, the daughter he had chosen nowhere to be found, and the daughter he had thrown away holding the only lifeline he had left. The symmetry was almost too perfect. I didn't respond, but I didn't delete the messages anymore either. I started saving them. I don't know why exactly. Maybe for the same reason I had stayed at that company for so long despite every indignity. Some part of me was still collecting evidence, still hoping that if I accumulated enough proof of his failure, he would finally have to see me. The tragedy, of course, was that he already saw me. That was the problem. He saw me as the solution to a problem he had created, not as a person whose absence should have been prevented in the first place. The next week, I got a call from a number I did recognize. It was Marisol again, my old logistics coordinator, now working at a different company. She had heard things through the grapevine that she thought I should know. Vanessa hadn't just disappeared from the office. She had apparently attempted to secure a separate line of credit using company assets as collateral without my father's knowledge. The application had been flagged for fraud because she had listed herself as the sole owner of Halstead Textiles, which she technically wasn't. The bank had contacted my father directly, and that conversation had apparently been the breaking point. Marisol said that people at the office were talking about a screaming match in the parking lot, my father and Vanessa, voices so loud that the loading dock workers could hear every word. He accused her of destroying the company. She accused him of never believing in her, of setting her up to fail, of comparing her to me. Yes, me. The daughter who had been erased was suddenly the standard against which she was being measured, and she couldn't stand it. She had driven away in her car and hadn't been back since. That phone call from Marisol changed something in me. Up until that moment, I had been watching the destruction from a safe distance, like someone observing a fire from across the river. But now I understood that the fire was not just consuming a business. It was consuming the entire mythology my family had built around itself. The mythology of my sister's talent, my father's wisdom, my mother's peacemaking silence. Every beam was cracking, and the people inside were clawing at each other. I had been cast out, but in some ways, I was the only one who had gotten out alive. The messages continued. By the start of the 3rd month, I had received 27 texts, 4 voicemails, and 1 letter delivered by certified mail. The letter was the strangest. My father had typed it on company letterhead, as if writing to a vendor or a former client. It was formal and structured, with bullet points outlining the current state of the business, a list of accounts lost, a plea for my return in a consulting capacity, and an offer of compensation. He even included a draft contract. It was the most my father had ever offered me, and it was also the most impersonal way he could have done it. I read the letter once, placed it in a drawer, and didn't look at it again. What I realized was that he still didn't understand. He thought this was a transaction, a negotiation between estranged business partners. He didn't understand that the damage was relational, not financial. You cannot draft a contract to fix the fact that you valued someone so little that you only noticed their worth after they were gone. At 30 messages, my mother called. I hadn't spoken to her since the day I was escorted out. She had stayed silent through all of it, as she had through everything, a quiet satellite orbiting my father and sister's drama. Her voice was strained and thin. She told me my father wasn't sleeping, that he had lost weight, that he spent hours in his study just staring at a wall. She said that he wanted me to know that whatever I decided, he understood. I asked her if she understood. There was a long pause, and then she said something I will never forget. I always knew it was wrong, I just didn't know how to stop it. I didn't know what to do with that. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a defense. It was just a quiet admission of complicity, spoken by a woman who had spent decades perfecting the art of not choosing sides. I told her I needed more time. I didn't tell her that I was already leaning toward a decision, just not the one she was hopping for. Because here's the thing. While all of this was unfolding, I was thriving. My new role at Meridian Supply Group was everything I had been denied at Halstead. I had a team that respected me, a CEO who trusted my judgment, and resources that allowed me to build without fighting for every penny. The contrast was so stark it almost felt like a cosmic joke. The people who had told me I was too aggressive had given me to a company that considered my aggression an asset. The people who had said I didn't have the temperament for leadership had handed me to an organization that promoted me within 6 months. I didn't just land on my feet. I launched. And now my father wanted me to give all of that up to go back to a burning building and save people who had locked the doors behind me. Worse than that, he wanted me to do it while the sister who had caused the fire was still out there, not answering her own phone, having abandoned him exactly as he had taught her to treat people, as disposable when they no longer served a purpose. I saw the parallel, and I knew that if I went back, I would be reinforcing the very pattern that had destroyed me. I would be proving that I was the reliable one, the safe one, the one who could always be counted on to absorb damage and keep going. And I was done being that person. The 47th message arrived on a Sunday morning, exactly 1 year after I had been walked out of that building. I remember counting them, scrolling through my phone in the pale light of early morning, tracing the arc of his desperation from formal to frantic to broken. Message 31, I'm sorry. Message 36, you were right about everything. Message 41, please just tell me what I have to do to fix this. Message 44, I can't lose this business, it's all I have. Message 47, the last one he ever sent, was just 3 words. I need you. I stared at that screen for a very long time. 3 words that, coming from my father, would have once meant everything to me. 3 words that were arriving a year too late. I didn't answer, but I did something else, something I had not planned, something that felt both like closure and like a door opening into a phase of this story that no one, least of all my family, could have predicted. I picked up the phone and called Gerald Fincher. I told him I was ready to discuss the terms of my involvement in the acquisition, not as a consultant picking bones, as a partner. Because if Halstead Textiles was going to survive, it would be on my terms, under my control, and without a single member of my family holding the reins ever again. That was the moment the real story began. The meeting with Gerald Fincher took place in a glass-walled conference room overlooking a city that had never cared about my family's drama. I arrived with a leather portfolio containing 2 things: my employment contract from Meridian Supply Group and a term sheet for the acquisition of Halstead Textiles that I had drafted myself. Gerald had his lawyers, his analysts, a whole apparatus of people who evaluate risk in decimal points. But I had something they didn't. I had spent 15 years inside that company. I knew where the bodies were buried, literally and metaphorically. I knew which accounts could be revived with a single phone call and which suppliers would return if they never had to see Vanessa's face again. I knew that the brand still had latent equity in certain regional markets. And I knew, with absolute certainty, that if anyone was going to salvage what remained, it would have to be me. Gerald asked what I wanted. I told him I wanted operational control, a founding partner stake, and a clause that permanently barred my father and sister from any management role, any board seat, and any authority over financial decisions. He smiled and said, "You've thought about this." I told him I'd been thinking about it my whole life. Negotiations moved fast. The bank that had called my father's loan was eager to avoid a messy bankruptcy that would tank the asset value. Gerald's firm was willing to acquire the debt at a discount and restructure it under a new entity. My contribution wasn't capital. It was sweat equity, industry relationships, and the promise that I could rebuild what Vanessa had destroyed. The legal issue around the falsified inventory numbers complicated everything, but Gerald's lawyers crafted a settlement proposal. The new entity would assume all liabilities in exchange for a full release of claims against my father personally. I made sure that release did not extend to Vanessa. That was not a detail I slept on. She had signed documents she knew were false. She had attempted to secure fraudulent credit. She had abandoned the company when it needed her most. If consequences were going to float down like snow, they were going to land exactly where they belonged. By the time the deal was ready to present, my father had sent 47 messages and heard nothing back. He didn't know I'd been negotiating the purchase of his life's work from the very buyers he had tried and failed to impress. He didn't know that my silence was not weakness but preparation. The call finally came not from my phone, but through an intermediary. Gerald's office sent a formal letter requesting a meeting with Mr. Halstead and his legal counsel. It wasn't a plea. It was a summons. My father walked into that conference room expecting to meet with the private equity firm that had rejected him. What he found was me. I was seated at the head of the table, flanked by Gerald and two attorneys. I watched his face cycle through confusion, recognition, something that might have been hope, and then a slow, dawning comprehension that he had walked into a room where he held zero power. He asked what was going on. I slid the term sheet across the polished wood and told him I was there to buy his company. The daughter he sent away had come back to own everything he had left. The silence that followed lasted maybe 15 seconds. It felt like a geological era. My father's eyes moved over the document, line by line, his mouth slightly open. He was reading the conditions: full management authority to me, a lifetime ban on his operational involvement, a limited consulting stipend that would keep him financially afloat but far from comfortable, and a separate clause that excluded Vanessa from any employment, ownership, or profit participation. He looked up. "You can't do this," he said. I answered calmly that I wasn't doing anything. The private equity firm was making the offer, and I was the partner they had chosen to run the restructured company. He could accept the deal, avoid personal bankruptcy, and walk away with a shred of dignity. Or he could reject it and watch the bank liquidate his assets, his house, and his reputation in open court. Those were his options. There was no third door. He tried to appeal to sentiment, family, history, all the things he had never offered me when it mattered. He said I was punishing him, that I had always been the one with the harder heart. I let him talk. I let him exhaust every argument he had ever used to manipulate me into accepting less. And when he was finished, I reminded him of the morning he had security escort me out of the building I saved. I reminded him of the bus, the graduation, the childhood I had spent being told I was independent so that he could justify ignoring me. I reminded him of the 4 years I spent rebuilding his company while he called me the little numbers person. And then I pointed to the signature line at the bottom of the term sheet. "You have 72 hours, I said. "After that, the offer expires and the bank moves forward with forced liquidation." He signed the papers the next afternoon. He had no choice. He had never been able to see a future without me in it, and now that future was arriving with my signature next to his. The fallout came in waves. Vanessa resurfaced 3 days later, apparently having heard through some back channel that the company was being sold. She called me from an unknown number, furious, accusing me of orchestrating a hostile takeover, of turning the family against her, of stealing what was rightfully hers. I listened for about 2 minutes, and then I hung up. I didn't need to justify anything to her. The legal documents made her position clear. She had no ownership stake, no standing, and no future in any organization I controlled. Her attempt to secure credit using company assets had been flagged, and while I chose not to pursue criminal charges, I made sure the industry knew what she had done. Her career in any legitimate business in that city was effectively over. That was not cruelty. That was accountability. The day after the acquisition closed, I walked back into the Halstead Textiles warehouse for the first time in over a year. The place was a shell. Inventory had been sold off at a loss to cover payroll gaps. The remaining employees, the ones who hadn't fled, were demoralized and waiting for the axe. I called a meeting in the loading bay and told them 3 things. First, nobody was losing their job that day. Second, we were going to rebuild. Third, the company would now be run by people who understood that loyalty flows in both directions. A few of them cried. Most just looked stunned. It was the beginning of a very long turnaround, but it was a beginning. My father, true to the agreement, stayed away. He received his monthly stipend, enough to keep the house and pay his bills, but not enough to pretend he had won anything. He called once, about a month after the signing, asking if we could talk. Not about business, just talk. I said I wasn't ready. That was the truth, and it was also a form of power I had never possessed before, the power to decide when and whether he would have access to me. His access was no longer a given. It was a privilege he had to earn, and he had so far done nothing to earn it. But the surprising detail, the thing I didn't see coming, arrived 6 months into the rebuild. My mother showed up at my new office unannounced. She looked smaller than I remembered, and there was a suitcase in her hand. She told me she had left my father. She said watching the acquisition unfold, seeing me stand up for myself in ways she never had broken something loose in her. She had spent decades as a silent accomplice, and she couldn't do it anymore. I didn't embrace her immediately. Some wounds are too old for quick healing, but I gave her a place to stay, and I told her we could talk as long as she understood that silence was no longer acceptable. She nodded. It was a start. In a strange way, that moment, not the signing ceremony or the first profitable quarter, felt like the real resolution of the story. The family mythology had finally fractured, and from the cracks, something honest was beginning to grow. A year after the acquisition, Halstead Textiles was profitable again. Not the tripled revenue of my earlier years, not yet, but stable. We had resecured the hotel chain contract that Vanessa had lost, signed 3 new regional distribution deals, and started rebuilding the supplier relationships that had been neglected. The employees who had stayed through the collapse got equity. The ones who had left got honest references. Word spread through the industry that Halstead was no longer a cautionary tale, but a redemption story, and that brought talent back. My father still lived in the same house, alone now. Occasionally, I would see him at a distance, at a restaurant or driving through town, and he would look toward me with an expression I can only describe as longing mixed with shame. He never approached. I still had not answered the 47 messages, but I did read them again once after the first profitable quarter, and I found that they no longer had power over me. They were just words on a screen, evidence of a man who had only learned to value things after he lost them, and I was no longer something he could lose. I had become the owner of my own life, and that is a kind of freedom no inheritance, no family blessing, and no apology can ever bestow. That is a thing you take for yourself, and once you have it, no one can ever take it back. If you are watching this and recognizing pieces of your own story, the favoritism, the quiet neglect, the moment you realized you were valued only for what you could provide, hear me clearly. Walking away from that dynamic is not betrayal. It is self-preservation. It is the beginning of an honest life. My father once handed my sister a company I built and told me I was too aggressive. For a long time, I believed that said something about my worth. Now I see it for what it was. A loud announcement about who they were, not who I had to remain. The 47 messages I never answered are now just words on a screen, but they represent something larger. They represent the moment the person who discarded you finally understands what they lost. And you, standing on the other side of that silence, get to decide whether their late realization earns a door you are no longer required to open. Not every bridge you burned was yours to rebuild. Some fires were started by people who never thought you'd stop being the one to put them out. I can't change the years where I accepted less because I didn't know I deserved more. I can't rewrite the morning I was walked out of a company I had saved. But I can tell you that the life you build after you stop waiting for approval is stronger than anything you constructed while begging for it. Competence does not need permission. Loyalty does not require self-destruction. We tell these stories because someone out there needs to be reminded that your value is not measured by how much exploitation you tolerate. If this resonated, hit subscribe and let us know in the comments what time it is, where you are, and where you're watching from. We'll be back with more stories of people who stopped waiting for permission and started writing their own endings. I'm Mallory Hayes, and this has been Revenge Nickel. All stories on this channel are fictional and created for educational purposes. This story highlights the importance of self-worth, healthy boundaries, and the courage to walk away from toxic relationships, even when they wear the face of family. Through these narratives, we hope you find the strength to question unfair treatment, recognize manipulation, and choose a future built on respect and independence. Real love is shown through consistent support, not control or exploitation.